Welcome to NI Chamber Studio Sessions. I'm Stuart Anderson, and today we're going to be looking at one of the biggest economic constraints in Northern Ireland, and sometimes it's one that's particularly overlooked, and that's the issue of wastewater infrastructure. I'm joined by John Davison, Head of Strategic Communications at Turley, and Andrew Webb, who's Managing Director at OCO Global. They co-author a major new report examining how underinvestment in wastewater is holding us back on key issues like housing, delaying investment, and ultimately putting a brake on our economy. This has been an issue, both of you, that has been something that we've all been working on for some time. And John, I suppose over a process of time, a wastewater infrastructure group has emerged of a number of business organisations and trade bodies on the issue of wastewater infrastructure, the underinvestment and the challenges that that's now beginning to create. Can you maybe just give us a background to who the Wastewater Infrastructure Group is, and actually just if we could step back a little bit, what problem is it that they're trying to solve?
Thanks, Stuart. Yeah, so the Wastewater Infrastructure Group, as you say, it's a consortium really of a number of business and construction and housing groups. So the Chamber's taken a big lead in that, but in partnership with the Construction Employers Federation and the Chartered Institute of Housing, who are the core sponsors of this new piece of research. But it was predated by a piece of work that we did last year that really looked at the impact that wastewater constraint was having. And that was, again, the Chamber and CEF, but also looking at the housing and social housing sector. So NIFA was involved. But over the past 12 months or so, we've seen more sectors of the economy start to see the concerns in real time. So we've been joined by Manufacturing Northern Ireland, the Northern Ireland Retail Consortium, and most recently the IOD. And that really completes the picture of the group as we see it today. But the reason why more groups have come and joined the consortium, the Wastewater Infrastructure Group, is because this concern is now having a real impact, not just in the construction sector, not just in the delivery of housing, but every part of our economy, whether it's manufacturing, retail, housing. We're all starting to see the impacts show up.
And that original report, that was really trying to demonstrate how significant the constraint was. Can you maybe just paint a picture as to what that is, and then we can maybe progress as to into why we've looked at this new report?
Yeah, well, that report was really two pieces of research undertaken by Andrew and my colleague Catherine Murray, and it was looking at two different things. One was looking at, well, what's the impact of what we assumed would be the impact of wastewater at the time? What was the constraint if we saw housing starts continue to fall, as we have done, to record low levels? And we were looking really only at the housing sector. We weren't looking at other parts of the economy. And we were seeing at that time a potential investment foregone of about 4.4 billion over the next price control period. Colossal numbers and really difficult to get your head around for the sort of average listener.
Yeah.
But more importantly, we were trying to be constructive and trying to put proposals together, and that's where Andrew came in with a really important suggestion about how we came up with a mechanism to fund the price control, which is the mechanism through which NI Water actually can deliver on infrastructure. And at the moment, it only receives about half of what it thinks it needs for the period up to the end of the next price control, which is 2040. And that through that research, Andrew, maybe it's more for you, but we struck upon the idea of a levy.
Yeah, absolutely. So the premise was, listen, there is a gap in funding. How do we fill it? And are there new ways we can do that? Are there ways that haven't been considered yet? But actually, the premise was there from just the 2007 review of NI Water and taking those findings and saying, if we started to think about a hypothecated levy on the rates bill, what would that enable us to do? Not just from an investment in NI Water, but from going to the market and borrowing the significant amounts of money that are needed to actually deliver on this deficit. So taking that premise, the modelling behind it was then to a range of assumptions really around what would be the interest rate. So we thought about a 50-year gilt yield and thought about 5.5% to 6% interest.
Sure.
The mechanism then to pay that back would be that levy idea on the rates, and model that through on a whole range of different scenarios, really to understand what would it mean to the average person and the average household in Northern Ireland on their rates bill, And when we modelled all that through, it was coming out at about £100 per household per year on the rates bill. We've refined the numbers since because this is a moving feast in terms of interest rates and in terms of the deficit that NI Water infrastructure faces. So when we took the draft multi-annual budget and tracked it through, the levy amount fell to about £65 per household per year. And that, I understand that that's an additional burden potentially on households. So it was important for us to understand, let's take two extremes of ratepayers in Northern Ireland. So a £500 rates bill and the maximum rates bill that you can be subject to in Northern Ireland. And the £500 rates bill would be a levy of about £27 per household per year. And the other end of that scale then would be about £300 per household per year. So those were the ranges under which we were working. And our conclusion was that to deliver an economy that has a sufficient wastewater infrastructure capacity in it, there's a levy on households there that is doable and is for many affordable and would still have the protections that people who can't afford their household rates, all those protections would still be there as well.
And John, I think one of the things that's really important around this is trying to find a palatable solution that works politically, but also works in terms of the economics, and that's why Andrew's work has been really important. But what's the distinction between this proposal and water charges, and is it just this, or are there other things that we looked at in the round to bring around, I guess, a more complete solution?
Yeah, I think, well, first of all, I think people are under the illusion that they already pay for their wastewater infrastructure and their rates, and to some degree that's true, but they don't pay to the level that we see in other regions of the UK, or indeed in other parts of these islands. And the impact of that is that over literally decades, Northern Ireland Water hasn't had the investment, and Northern Ireland as a whole hasn't had its investment in infrastructure that's required. And the deficit, as I mentioned earlier, is about 50% what NI Water currently receives in their capital infrastructure budget, which is just over 300 million a year. And during the price control, they need to increase that average to about 700 million a year. Now, the proposal for our levy is we know that water charges at the consumer point, at the point of users, is going to be disproportionately impacting those people who are on the lowest household incomes, the people who are in most need of support. And we propose the levy because it's progressive. It doesn't affect those people who are on social housing or affordable housing benefit. And it focuses on a proportion of what people are already paying through the rates, but actually addressing the problem. And so we agree, this consortium has agreed that wastewater charges for consumers is just not politically palatable. It isn't fair. It isn't progressive. This proposal was a way of addressing that in a realistic way that reconnects what people pay through their rates into the infrastructure. And I think that's actually something where most people are ahead of our politicians here. They are prepared to pay for services if it means enabling growth through jobs and construction, if it means that people can get access to the housing market. But it was the thing that grabbed the headline, right? So we talked about £100 on the average household per year, and then we revised that down to about 65, and that worked out about £125 per week. Yeah. But that's a moving feast, and it was the thing that grabbed the headlines, but it wasn't the only thing we suggested. I think importantly, the Northern Ireland Fiscal Council had, just before we published that report, had published its own report.
It's just a matter of weeks, wasn't it? It was
literally, I think, about 2 weeks before. In fact, we had to sort of step up getting the report ready so that we could respond to that. And I always remember a quote from Professor Robert Choate at the Infrastructure Committee, where he said, "Look, you can carry on with the status quo, but there isn't a system anywhere in the world that doesn't pay and have a payer contribution to its water infrastructure where it works." And so that is really the choice. We can either have a system that doesn't work, or we can pay a little bit more per household. £1.25 a week is what we think it is at the moment, but that will change.
I think it's really important, though, as well, in all of this, to just reiterate that people do think they pay for water through the rates. They don't. We pay our rates, and that goes into the centre to the executive, and that can be allocated in any way they choose. Now, traditionally, obviously, infrastructure gets an allocation,
Yeah.
and NI Water gets an allocation from that. But a key element of a levy idea was that it would be ring fenced specifically for
Yeah.
water infrastructure, which would then allow NI Water to go out to the market and borrow
Yeah.
and say that this is how it would be serviced,
Yeah.
and this is locked in as
And a lot
something
of
to
this,
service that.
is capital spend. And just to give a sense of, for those that maybe don't fully comprehend that, what's wastewater competing against whenever it comes down to executive deciding what it's going to spend its money on? Because and I think the important point is it's not just capital. There's a significant amount of resource needed to support that.
I mean, if we look at the capital infrastructure budget across the executive departments, I mean, we've seen the priorities in health and education, and for not just this executive, but for prior executives, the Department for Infrastructure, or DRD, or its previous iterations, has always been under-resourced. So we've got sympathy for the minister's position. We've got sympathy for the fact that there is a deficit in the infrastructure, capital that's required, and it's a choice between: do we fund our roads? Do we fund our public transport? Do we fund our wastewater? What we're saying is that those priorities need political leadership. They need decisions to be made. And one of those decisions is about having a realistic conversation with industry and with the public about how we fund our infrastructure, because the block grant as it stands can't address all of those competing priorities at once.
Yeah.
If we take just the infrastructure Department for Infrastructure's investment in NI Water over the last couple of years, it's been around that 300 million mark, and that's really doing is ensuring that you and I have clean drinking water. It's not really unlocking any environmental gain, protection of our rivers, our locks. It's not addressing new infrastructure for housing.
And a lot of this infrastructure goes back to Victorian times.
Some of it is literally, over 100 years old.
Yeah.
And so this isn't just a problem that's arisen in the short term. This is something that goes back all the way back to the foundation of the state.
Yeah. And Andrew, last summer, because Assembly goes into the recess, we published the report in June, and we spend a lot of time going out with our members across a number of sectors. And what was becoming increasingly apparent to us was that this wastewater issue was not something that was exclusively a problem for construction or house building, but it was starting to have an impact on manufacturers and some others. And so there began the idea of looking at the economic impact and our report that's published this week.
Yeah.
Do you want to maybe give a sense of what this report has uncovered in terms of some headlines, and maybe unpack the model that you've looked at to develop it?
Yeah, because you're right, the impacts go across much broader than than the narrative, I suppose, had started to hone in on. And there was also a narrative that had emerged from the minister about how he didn't want to impose an extra burden on hard-pressed families. And the idea behind the modelling then became, but if we fixed it, infrastructure, what could it mean? And is there a tipping point then between the impact? Because yes, we have to accept we would be taking money out of people's pockets, but that money would be invested in infrastructure, and it would be invested in the economic capacity of Northern Ireland. And so we've modelled that through. We've taken a modelling approach that says, okay, we have a subtraction from consumer spending initially, and we invested in infrastructure, and we've done that through to get a little bit technical, gross fixed capital formation, and as a data point it's essentially capital spending in the economy, and we hit it, and we've hit it on the basis of across Northern Ireland where wastewater treatment works are most constrained, and we then look at the sectoral impacts that could be having. So construction, obviously a major issue if things are constrained, but construction has a supply chain, manufacturing has to operate, and that goes into then, in an economic modelling context, that flows right through into retail and culture and arts in terms of people's ability to have jobs, be productive and spend. So essentially what we're saying is that in an economy that we're creating currently, we're heading towards 2040, which is when we stopped our modelling, versus and we call that the constrained economy that we're heading towards. And then in 2040, we have another scenario where we fix the infrastructure issues in the water infrastructure. And we've had to lag it, obviously, because you can't just fix it all today. So,
Of course.
we start fixing it from about year 5 onwards in the model, and we start bringing in the economic return on that. So the headline finding from that modelling is that we're heading towards an economy in 2040 that's 10.9 billion smaller in 2040 than it could be if we fixed the wastewater infrastructure and released that productive capacity back into the system.
It's just a huge number. I mean, I think what comes across in the report is that this is just going to compound. And actually getting that across in general terms is really difficult. What is 10.9 billion? That's 1,000 million, and we're just not good with those big numbers. So we've tried to break it down again for people to grasp the enormity of this. And it works out that each household
in Northern Ireland in 2040 is £5,500 worse off in terms of economic output than it would otherwise be. And it's important to say that's in 2040. That is building from now. Every day that passes that we don't solve this problem, we are restricting our economic capacity. And so, this year or next year, it's about £350 per household in terms of lost economic opportunity, if you like.
Yeah.
And that builds year on year until we start fixing this and start bringing that back in. So that idea that, we can't impose an additional financial burden on hard-pressed families, an important point.
they're already feeling it.
But the upside of fixing it is significant.
Yeah.
And if we don't fix it, those households, all our households will be worse off permanently.
They are already feeling it. I mean, there are 55,000 homes that NI Water estimates can't connect at the moment. And what does that mean? It means higher rents. It means the cost of housing becomes unaffordable for younger people who are looking to get on the housing market. So I think we have to sort of dispel the myth that this isn't impacting people's lives already.
And the private rental sector in particular in Belfast and across Northern Ireland is increased significantly in the last couple of years post-COVID.
Yeah. And then you think about, good quality homes, new homes, very environmentally sound, and the health benefits of having a good quality home then start to impact into the health sector in terms of reduced need over time. So, this isn't just a purely economic question in the sense of GVA and jobs. It's very much that, but it goes
societal.
It goes societal, yeah.
If we just take the social housing component of it, the housing strategy looks at delivering at least 33,000 social homes by 2039. So just basically before the end of our report. Within this mandate, we have about 2,600 homes that need to be built, and our constraints are happening today. So it's unlikely we're going to see all of those homes that we need desperately, that people have been on. The waiting list is over 50,000 for social housing.
Yeah.
So this is a social issue.
Yeah.
This is not just an economic issue. This is absolutely impacting the heart of our economy, yes, but affecting everyone's lives in Northern Ireland.
I think that's the issue, though, isn't it? It's moving from numbers that, it could be 10 billion, it could be 20 billion, and actually trying to relate that to day-to-day life and to the real world is sometimes where the challenge is.
Yeah.
And I think what we've tried to do in this report, John, is to build it out with a series of case studies just to illustrate this is actually right now where the problem is biting, and then the related economic costs of that. Can you maybe just talk us through one or two of those?
Yeah, I mean, I'll not try and fire too many more numbers at everyone, but I mean, we're talking sitting beside an economist, but we're talking about things like mixed-use residential. What do we mean by that? We mean affordable homes, social homes, homes for private sale, homes for private rent. We have one example right in the city centre, part of an ambitious plan to deliver more housing in Belfast. But at the moment facing constraint and that, that scheme needs to find a solution. Now, there has been investment by the department. I want to make that clear. About 30 million has been spent in the last 2 years. It's unlocked about up to about, I think, 3,000 homes. And that's positive. But when we compare it to the 700 million a year that NI Water needs to actually equip us with the wastewater infrastructure that we need for the future, we're going to see more projects not delivered. There's a student housing scheme in South Belfast that would not just bring forward new accommodation for those students, but would unlock housing which is currently HMOs, and return that to residential housing stock for families and others. And it's the jobs it brings. We think a lot, and certainly Turley works a lot with developers, and we talk about the construction side and the jobs that will create.
And it's not an even picture either, Andrew, is it, in terms
No,
of constraints?
it's not,
So
no.
there are more areas of acute need across Northern Ireland?
Yeah, so when we modelled this, we looked at where the wastewater treatment works are at capacity or close to capacity, and then we looked at then the economic structure at a local authority level. So when you think about somewhere like Mid-Ulster, which is really like a manufacturing heartland and strong construction sector, it's particularly impacted as a result of that sectoral mix. Belfast is heavily impacted just as a result of the housing constraint issues and how that tracks through.
If I can pick that up, actually, one of the things we discussed in the report is the ambition of the local councils and their local development plans. Now, they're not all complete, so it's an incomplete picture. But if we look at the housing monitors and where the constraint lies, somewhere like Belfast, which has an ambition, a very significant ambition, to deliver, I think it's over 30,000 new homes. They've identified about 20,000 new homes in terms of actual sites, and 71% of those new sites are constrained. So we're going to have a fraction of the amount of ambition that the councils have set out, and that has big impacts on our economy as well as socially.
Yeah, I mean, if you're sitting with the Belfast agenda and you're responsible for delivering that, which is about more jobs, more people living in the city centre, a better quality of life, you're going to be sitting thinking, how do I deliver on any of that if this wastewater doesn't get solved?
If you're a manufacturing firm in Mid-Ulster and you want to set up and you want to expand and grow jobs and what is part of our rural economy, again,
And what's more, you're an international investor and you're already here and you're considering Northern Ireland versus somewhere else.
we talked.
Can I flush my toilet?
Yeah.
It's a key consideration in inward investment. Seemingly.
I spent a lot of my time in GB talking to GB into Northern Ireland investors or international into Northern Ireland or into UK. And one of the key things they look at is infrastructure and planning. And I know the Chamber's done an awful lot of work in terms of making recommendations to improve the planning system, and we've seen some of those gains, and that's helping improve investor confidence. One of the things I talked about earlier was rents rising. Oddly enough, that's improving the viability for some investors to invest into Belfast, maybe for the first time. We've seen the loft lines and the first build to rent. A lot of people are looking at that and thinking, what's next? There won't be a next if we can't address our wastewater constraint. And I think that's what's concerning now, is the international reputation as a place, a region to grow.
Yeah.
We're competing with other regions of the UK. We're competing with other regions on this island, and we don't have the infrastructure to keep up.
Yeah, and I think one of the challenges we have is finding a way forward with a executive that is a mandatory coalition that's facing into an election in less than 12 months' time. There's a huge amount of sympathy, I think, for politicians of trying to navigate those questions whilst trying to navigate questions about health and education, some of the climate change commitments, all of these things collectively, I guess, weighing down on the ability to think this issue through. And we're trying to do this, I guess, in quite a constructive way and think of a way forward. Are you particularly precious about how this is done, or what do you think would be a key ask of policymakers as they think about this, and our political parties as they think about this in the year ahead?
No, I think we're pragmatic. The Wastewater Infrastructure Group is open to suggestions here, and actually our proposal around a levy was us being pragmatic about putting something on the table and saying, look, we think this works, but if the executive and the executive as a mandatory coalition, we're not going to always find it easy to find agreement. This is so pressing that we've called on all party leaders to actually, over the summer, over the recess period, come together and try and come to a collective position ahead of the election. We can't afford to wait. There are homes that will not be built, cannot be built, because we do not have the wastewater infrastructure today, let alone in 2028, which is when the next price control period comes in.
I think like, for me, it's a case of if the politicians can come up with a way to fund this that doesn't involve a levy, then great. Like if they can go to Treasury and Treasury suddenly change tack and say, yeah, let's give you this money, fine. For me, the principle is there's a problem here that needs solved urgently. We're in a period now where we're capital rationing. We're given piecemeal amounts to solve a crisis that only buys a bit more time and doesn't fix the thing. And so we're really, really damaging our economic potential over this. And, it needs an injection of money urgently.
I applaud the Minister for Infrastructure. She managed to get 30 million out of the monitoring rounds over the last 2 years. That's about 10% of an annual budget. That's pretty significant. But it's inconsequential when it comes to the 700 million that at the moment is required every year to keep. And we can't. If you give that to Wastewater tomorrow, they couldn't spend it. They need to ramp up to that, and that means giving contractors certainty, the engineering firms that will deliver this wastewater. If we can't have that certainty, then they will go elsewhere, and we've already started to see that. We're also giving credit to the things that has been done by the Minister. Developer contributions is a controversial one, but we've endorsed voluntary contributions because every other part of the UK has this ability for developers to contribute something to the cost of a wastewater overflow or a water treatment plant if that unlocks their development. And that could really help in some cases. The Sustainable Urban Drainage Solutions, which is SUDS, which is it's a way of capturing rainwater overflow. It's great for the future, but it's only ever, even in the future, going to address a very small fraction, and really actually a bigger investment's needed in retrofitting. One of the things that was in our last report that didn't actually get a lot of attention, and just to pick up that point about the UK government and Treasury, we called for and will continue to call for and will continue to support any of the executive parties in calling for more funding to Northern Ireland's infrastructure. We asked for an infrastructure transformation fund to be considered. Why do we think that Northern Ireland needs it? Well, we talked about it earlier. Some of our infrastructure is Victorian. This isn't just an executive problem. This has been a UK government problem for a long time. We need that kind of maybe like a regional deal model where, it can be tied to unlocking particular projects, but we need a significant shot in the arm. So we're not I want to be clear, we don't not understand the constraints that are on the executive, but we have made it really simple.
And in trying to do this as well, I think it's important to point out this is not about mutualisation. This is not about privatisation. It's working within what we understand to be the political envelope for what's possible.
It is. I mean, I'm almost agnostic on how we find the money. From a modelling perspective, yes, we've put the levy in there to drive the model and to understand the difference between taking money from households here and putting it in over here, and we get an economy that's much more productive, much bigger than it could otherwise be. But if that money can come from somewhere else, then even better, you know. And there are absolutely negotiations to be had with HM Treasury. I mean, I think there's a narrative has started to build in Northern Ireland that we are sufficiently funded. I don't know if I subscribe to that. I think we're looking at England and that's not particularly well funded. So, we're comparing ourselves there. England needs a massive injection of infrastructure spending. If it finds a way to get that and we get Barnett consequentials, then we can start to nudge ourselves towards a part of the solution here. But the fundamental for me is we need, well over $1 billion, almost $2 billion of investment into our wastewater infrastructure. And there's no getting away from that. And if we don't solve it, the economy is going to be smaller than it could be.
I think, what we've called on is for all parties in the executive to recognise the problem and to acknowledge that the next price control period needs to be funded to a sustainable level set by the utility regulator. These are not Andrew or my figures, they're not NI Water's figures, they're set by the regulator and they're set to ensure that everyone has clean drinking water, the environment's protected. And the byproduct actually of that is that we unlock economic potential. And there's huge potential in Northern Ireland, but we are competing at the moment with two hands tied behind our back. If we look at even just south of the border and how they've prioritised infrastructure spending, they have the same problems. They have the same issues in terms of having to catch up, but they've been putting their surplus straight into Iscairn to actually upgrade some of their wastewater treatments, and we were just being outspent. And this is about two competing economies.
And so the report's published this week. What are the next steps then for the wastewater infrastructure group?
I think we've hit on some of the core focus. We're going to continue the dialogue with all executive parties. In fact, all parties, whether they're executive or not, because in the lead up to an election, we need this to be part of their manifesto commitments. But we need action now. And as I mentioned earlier, we've called for a meeting of all the party leaders with us to try and agree something on this ahead of the elections, so that we can get on with this in the next mandate. So we're not waiting for 18 to 20 months. I talked about developer contributions. It needs legislation passed by the Assembly, and it's going to be tricky to get that prioritised within this mandate. So we're going to be working on some of those areas. But ultimately this is about relating it on the ground. We're going to be bringing forward some of the case studies in the report and others that we're continuing to work on to try and just make the message really clear. This is harming people's quality of life. It's limiting young people's opportunity to get on the housing market. It's impacting on rents. It's impacting on our social housing. So it's just continuing to make sure that message is absolutely abundantly clear. 10.9 billion, in terms of our scale of our opportunity in our economy by 2040. We want, as a consortium of businesses, to grow the economy. It's what we're about. We want to make sure that message is heard.
I mean, we're leaving money on the table. It's as simple as that. If we fix this, we can get that economy that we've modelled as the success scenario, whereby the economy in 2040 10.9 billion bigger. That delivers that. It's not long ago we were being called the most exciting economic zone in the world. Now we could debate whether or not that was bunkum or not, but there is a really big opportunity for Northern Ireland's economy to take off here, but not with the brakes on.
Okay, thank you both for your contributions today. This is a conversation that I have no doubt we could continue long for the rest of today and perhaps for the rest of this week. But it's something that we're really pleased to be a part of as the Chamber. We're looking not just at the problem, not just at the potential scale of the problem, but where there are solutions. And it's going to be ever more important as we approach the election across the next 11, 12 months that we continue to work together, continue to build that coalition of the willing, and continue to look for solutions to this problem that is just not going away at this moment in time.